This audio is from Radio New Zealand. To find out more, visit radionz.co.nz.
I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā kārangarangatanga maha, o ngā haue whā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I raro i te parirau o te tiriti o Waitangi, e mihi mai oha ki au koutou kua taimai i tēnei pō. It's my privilege to welcome you as the Kaihautu and Acting Chief Executive to this forum here at Te Papa Tongarewa. One of our purposes is to be a forum for the nation, and at this time of the year where we reflect on changes and shifts in what is happening within New Zealand, it's been a great opportunity for us to continue to hold a series of discussions related to kaupapa of the Treaty of Waitangi. It's now my privilege to introduce Dr. Claudia Orange, who, along with Dean Knight, a senior lecturer of the law school at Victoria University, who will be chairing our series for this evening. So without further ado, if I can introduce Dr. Claudia Orange, who is currently the Director of Collections and Research here at Te Papa Tongarewa. Kia koe, Claudia, nau mai, haere mai.
Thank you, Michelle Hippolyte, and now kia ora tātou katoa, and welcome to the first of the 2010 Treaty Debate Series in Soundings Theatre Te Papa, Wellington. The series is organised by Te Papa in association with Victoria University's New Zealand Centre for Public Law. My name is Claudia Orange, Director of Collections and Research at Te Papa, and I'm chairing this session with Dean Knight, Associate Director of the New Zealand Centre for Public Law. Dean is not only a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law, he is one of the associate directors of the Centre for Public Law, and his scholarly work is very central to some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. His scholarly interests are in public law, particularly administrative law, judicial review, and local democracy. He's written and edited a number of articles, chapters, and books on New Zealand's system of constitutional and administrative law. And I'm particularly interested to see that he also has a blog on legal and policy issues called Laws 179, Elephants and the Law. The subject for this year's series is evolution and not revolution. And I might explain that I selected this title when reflecting recently on how New Zealand has changed over the 35 years since the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975. And unlike many other countries, we have taken an evolutionary path in race relations and not a revolutionary one. And yet, in the last 40 years, we've witnessed what I'd call revolutionary changes for our country and in our relationships between Maori and the state. Well, today, Professor Paul Spoonley is the first speaker, and the title of his presentation is Making New Zealand. His topic covers the years of activity in Maori and related matters that has led our country into an evolutionary pattern of change rather than the revolutionary one. Well, there have been key players in those years of change, and one is certainly Ranginui Walker, who is here with us and who will comment later on Paul's lecture. But first, I have much pleasure in introducing Professor Spoonley. Paul holds a personal chair in sociology at Massey University, Auckland. He began his academic research in the mid-1970s on the local reactions to the arrival of Pacific migrants. Since then, he has researched and written on Pākehā identity, Maori-Pākehā relations, right-wing extremism, and anti-Semitism. Currently, he heads a major research project on the present settlement of immigrants in New Zealand. Professor Paul Spoonley.
Nā mihi kia koutou, ka tika kia mihi atu kia Ranginui, tō iwi whakatuhia e rangatira tēnā koe, tēnā koutou katoa. I want to identify and discuss the events and the people that have contributed to what I believe can be justifiably referred to as a paradigm shift that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s in New Zealand. An imperial and colonial frame of reference was replaced by one that recognised to a much greater degree the Treaty of Waitangi and the rights of tangata whenua in the context of a liberal democratic state. How we now currently operate in our public spaces and renegotiated sense of what it means to be a New Zealander is dramatically different from that had occurred previously. The shift has required that our key institutions, Parliament, the justice and education systems, for instance, operate in ways that are now very different, and often radically so, and without precedent to guide those responsible. It thrust new people and new organisations into leadership roles, and one of those who played a key role, Ranginui Walker, is with us tonight, and I'll return to his contribution shortly. The events of the mid-20th century set the scene for what was to follow. With some notable exceptions, the state had pursued what I would define as ethnocide, of seeking to achieve the cultural assimilation, the total cultural assimilation of Maori until the 1970s and the 1980s. But if cultural assimilation was the goal, the reality was that Maori were marginalised economically and largely confined to very poor rural areas in New Zealand. By the 1930s, half of all Pākehā lived in urban communities in this country, and a third lived in 4 main cities. I should add that the threshold of what constituted an urban community was modest, 8,000 people. What effectively changed the socioeconomic and spatial separation between Maori and Pākehā was the Second World War. The war has been labelled the People's War because it mobilised large numbers and that this involvement took place with popular support. It certainly mobilised Maori, and it was inevitable that, having taken part in such a nationally and globally important event, that returning to remote rural communities might not be attractive. The state also played its role with the 1945 Social and Economic Advancement Act and incentives to encourage greater Maori participation in the growing urban sector. The result was the relocation of Maori to urban and Pākehā New Zealand. In 1945, at least 75% of Maori were located in rural areas, and some estimates put that figure at 85%. By the mid-1970s, the figure had flipped completely, with 75% now urban dwellers and 20% of them in Auckland. The size, rapidity and impact of this migration was very significant for what was to follow. But if this meant Maori and Pākehā were in much closer proximity, it did not mean necessarily that Maori were any more engaged in many aspects of our contemporary New Zealand society. In the 1950s, less than 5% of Maori left school having obtained school certificate. And of the 3,000 students at the University of Auckland, fewer than 20 were Maori. But this migration did 2 things. It did eventually give more Maori an opportunity to access the institutions of urban New Zealand, and this did eventually provide a leadership for what was to follow. But it also highlighted what had been lost through the process of colonisation and ethnocide. The contrast was increasingly there for all to see between the affluence of many Pākehā and the position of Māori, between the lack of recognition of Māori culture and language and the emphasis given to European-derived values and institutions. It was perhaps inevitable that that situation would be challenged and would no longer be tolerated, and the trigger points were to come in the mid-1960s when the Pritchard Waitford report on Māori land titles and the 1967 Māori Affairs Amendment Act occurred. Enter stage left new players in the form of Māori protest groups. The 1970 Young Māori Leaders Conference produced Ngā Tamatoa. They represented a young, urban-born and raised generation who were happy to contest colonialism in new ways. It's also, I think, important to acknowledge what was happening internationally. It could be argued that in 1945 the British Empire was at its peak. A small island off continental Europe had withstood the ambitions of European fascism by marshalling its extensive global resources to fight, along with the help of allies such as the USA. It was Britain's finest hour. In that euphoria, the British government passed the 1945 Colonial Development and Welfare Act, which signalled their willingness to take economic responsibility for all of its colonial subjects and to provide for self-government. But it soon became apparent that the first commitment could not be met, while the second meant the decline of the empire and its replacement with the Commonwealth. Britain was no longer the superpower that we knew, and it turned its attention to becoming part of Europe despite de Gaulle's antagonism. The cultural and economic umbilical cord that had tied New Zealand to Britain for most of its colonial history was now under threat. The new superpower was, of course, the USA, and it was to provide one very interesting dimension and influential exemplar of protest politics. The black civil rights movement gained in momentum through the 1950s and 1960s, and it was to supply Maori activists with a new rhetoric as well as some new strategies. Interestingly, that rhetoric did not necessarily come from those black American activists, but it came from the French Caribbean in the form of writers and activists such as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon. Here were arguments about the importance of black activism in the process, what was increasingly a global process, of decolonisation. After all, the white working class and their organisations were not going to be interested in helping blacks. It was also a time of rebellion of the young. As the English commentator Eric Hobsbawm notes, the golden age of widespread influence was coming to an end, and the student uprisings in Paris in May 1968 soon had global equivalents from communist Europe to the USA and Mexico, and of course New Zealand. Hobsbawm goes on to observe that these students stood, quote, at an awkward angle to the rest of society. They had no established place. Well, that was certainly true of Maori protest politics. One of the first times that many of us began to realise that this was the case came with the land march from Te Hapua to Parliament in 1975. The organising group, Te Matakete o Aotearoa, involved both conservative and radical elements in what was a fragile coalition, a coalition that only lasted until Parliament, when agreement about aims and strategies collapsed. For much of the next decade, the politics of younger Māori recast the issues and possibilities of identity rights in New Zealand. For me, one of the most powerful statements came in the form of the Donna Awatere essays, which appeared in Broadsheet, and then her 1985 book, Maori Sovereignty. The possibility that a nation-state could be subdivided and that some of the state's sovereignty might be allocated to Māori was and remains a very powerful claim. She not only challenged Pākehā to rethink their commitment to colonial institutions and values, she also directed her criticism at Māori institutions and leadership. The period from the Land March in 1975 to the appearance of the Maori Sovereignty book in 1984 was the period of Maori mobilisation. It started with a relatively small group of younger committed activists and ended with the support of major Maori leaders and organisations. A new phase of recognition and policy was to emerge as the decade of the 1980s continued, but at this point I think it's timely to recognise a key player in these politics, Professor Ranginui Walker. In writing Ranginui's biography, which was recently published as Matatoa, I realised how transforming these decades had been for individuals such as Ranginui, as much as they had been for our institutions. At the Auckland Readers and Writers Festival last year, I described Ranginui as an accidental activist. As he himself acknowledges, he was an unlikely player, much less a leader in the identity politics of the 1970s and 1980s. He was a product of a conservative religious and political background. He was schooled in a Catholic education system, and his family were national supporters. The latter's hardly unique. If we look back at those older Māori who played a leadership role in the 1970s, people such as Mat Tahau, John Rangihau, Graham Latimer, James Henare, and Whina Cooper, all were involved in the National Party and nearly all held senior positions in it. But Ranginui was to tread a different path, and I think two things are particularly influential. The first was that he was highly qualified in an educational sense. Very few Māori were PhD qualified, certainly in 1970 when he finished his degree. It gave him skills and a status. But secondly, he was recruited by his uncle, Mat Tahau, to help run the Auckland District Māori Council. The catchment for this particular Māori council included both traditional iwi and hapu groupings, but also, of course, the growing migrant urban Māori. From the 1970 Young Maori Leaders Conference and the establishment of Ngā Tamatoa, and Ranginui was there, Ranginui was exposed to these politics of the Maori Renaissance. His destiny was set in part by his own educational achievements, but also by his growing involvement in these urban politics. Ranginui, of course, in turn became a key contributor to the developments that were to take place over the next decades. The Auckland District Maori Council, under his leadership, became an important voice on the issues as they emerged both within and in Auckland and a national context. At times, the council looked and sounded quite different to every other Maori council, including the National Maori Council. Sport in context with South Africa was one issue where Ranginui and the Auckland District Maori Council were to provide a moral compass. His column in The Listener and then his book, Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou, were to offer insights into a colonial history and Māori concerns to a New Zealand that had seldom encountered such direct criticism of our major institutions and of our leaders. Our understanding of our history was being revised, and as the historian Michael Belgrave notes, Ranginui helped develop, quote, a grand indigenous narrative that not only told a very different story of cultural survival of Māori, but indicated what was required to restore justice as he and others saw it. Of course, this task was not left to Ranginui alone, and Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou was preceded by a number of Pākehā historians and others who helped construct a very different history of colonialism. Honourable mention ought to be made of Dick Scott, Claudia Orange, Jock Phillips, Jamie Bellich, and Anne Salmond. But Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou, which was published in 1990, was the most important and influential colonial history by a Māori author. What is interesting is that his criticisms were couched in a language which was familiar to the middle classes who provided the management and leadership of our core institutions. His was an original and powerful voice in critiquing the state, although of course not the only voice. It was a voice that took the arguments of an international politics of liberation, the Marxism of Gramsci and the notion of hegemony, the critiques of colonialism offered by Fanon and Césaire, the liberation theory and the possibilities of a transformative education of Frere and Illich, and put them into a New Zealand vernacular. Here was a set of intellectual ideas applied to the particular circumstances of this country. He was influenced by critical and Marxist traditions, but not in a theoretical or dogmatic way. The ultimate benchmark was that these ideas needed to work in a New Zealand setting, and they needed to speak to New Zealanders, including those New Zealanders who had no interest in Marxism. What is intriguing is that we start with a son of the empire, of Catholicism, of a traditional tikanga, who became a critic of all these dimensions of a colonial New Zealand. If you doubt the claims about his willingness to critique his own, including the relevance of traditional Māori values to the position faced by contemporary Māori, then I suggest you read his book, O Poriki Mai Tawhiti, on his own iwi, whakatuhia. By 1984, a new agenda had been set and the ambitions of Māori clearly articulated. At its core was the need to recognise the Treaty of Waitangi and the commitments made by the signatories to each other. Of course, the understanding was that any failures had been largely those of the Crown. There ought to be some reallocation of resources so that while Māori might not gain exactly what they had lost, there would at least be some recognition of these losses as well as a resource base on which to fund Māori futures. The claims that the core institutions of New Zealand were institutionally racist invited a reconsideration of how they might more adequately recognise and respond to Māori communities. And the claims of Māori sovereignty, by now identified as tino rangatiratanga, raised questions about the devolution of resources and services so that Māori organisations and communities could control their own destiny, at least partially. It was a radical agenda, a revolutionary agenda, but underpinning it was something much more fundamental about the nation-state. For much of the 20th century, it was assumed that a state operated on behalf of a single nation, that the two, the nation and the state, were indivisible. The state represented all New Zealanders. It deserved their undivided loyalty, and in return the state was neutral with respect to the ethnic identity of its citizens. The identity politics of Māori challenged all of these elements. The nation was made up, it was argued, of two key groups, and the operation of the state ought to recognise the particular circumstances and the rights of Māori, something which it had not done previously. In fact, the state was seen to operate in ways that directly disadvantaged Māori. The state was hardly neutral. According to Ranginui and others, the state preserved Pākehā interests, even if it continued to claim universality and neutrality. It was a radical rethinking of what the nation-state of New Zealand ought to be. It required a decoupling of the nation, now defined as Māori and Pākehā or Māori and the Crown, and required the state to operate in new and different ways. A new understanding and a new social contract needed to be established. But of course, there was no compulsion for the state to acknowledge these new expectations. It was left to the good sense and the sensitivities of some key players, Māori, Pākehā and representatives of the state, to explore what this meant. It is important to acknowledge that there has been something of a history in policy documents that have documented some of the fundamental inequities faced by Māori. The book, The Māori People Today, edited by I.L.G. Sutherland, which appeared in 1940, still provides a very interesting account of the ways in which Māori were marginalised in New Zealand, as does the 1960 Hun Report. And by the 1970s, there were Pākehā groups such as the Auckland Committee on Racism and Discrimination that were adding to the evidence. Was the state going to respond? And if so, how? Well, it did, of course, and the 1975 Treaty Waitangi Act was a cautious but still very important first step. Norm Kirk's Waitangi Day speeches are worth revisiting in this regard. By the way, they're available in a publication called Towards Nationhood. On the 6th of February 1973, he said, and I quote, "The Treaty of Waitangi has stood for 133 years. The focus and dignity of that agreement should and will be recognised by Parliament in a form that signifies and symbolises the importance of that treaty to every New Zealander." And a year later, on the same occasion, he said, and I quote, "As Britain joins her destiny with Europe's, we must now draw upon the spiritual and cultural strength of the people who make our nation. I know we have not reached the end of the road. We have scarcely started the journey. The Māori people are in the midst of a great migration as significant and meaningful as the migration that brought them to the shores of New Zealand. As they move from country to town, as the lifestyle changes, as the old traditions of history and culture are drawn upon, so new methods, new traditions are in the making. All of us together are, in our own way, making New Zealand." They were prophetic words and indicate something of Norm Kirk's sympathy for what was emerging. But the action was to be curtailed as that sympathy was not shared by the subsequent national government led by Muldoon. It was left to the 1984 Labour government to take up the challenge, and the irony was that at the same time that policy and legislation provided for identity recognition and reparation, the effect of the Labour government's own economic reforms had a devastating effect on Māori. Constitutional and policy recognition came at the expense of economic security for many Māori. The 1975 Land March in the final months of the 1972 Labour government had made it clear that the government had not lived up to its promises concerning Māori. A decade later, the 1984 Labour government's period in office began with yet another march, the Hikoi to Waitangi. That was a very powerful reminder that there were unfulfilled expectations concerning the recognition of Māori for the incoming government. But the Hikoi was also a powerful statement about who those expectations came from. The Hikoi now involved the full range of Māori political opinion and organisations, notably, of course, Tainui. The new Labour government of 1984 were prepared to recognise treaty rights. A group of ministers, Geoffrey Palmer, Koro Weteri and Russell Marshall, worked on the incorporation of the principles of the treaty into new legislation. The label principles was first referred to in the 1975 Treaty of Waitangi Act. In March 1986, a cabinet paper from Palmer and Weteri examined what recognition of the treaty meant for the government, and a June paper in the same year required that all legislation, and I quote, "draw attention to any implications for recognition of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi," end quote, and that Māori should be consulted. Between 1985 and 1989, 15 statutes included references to the treaty, and the treaty clause in the State-Owned Enterprises Act proved to be particularly significant. Did the government and its senior public service managers know what they were doing? I tend to agree with Claudia Orange, who has argued that the far-reaching implications of the Cabinet Directive on the treaty were not at first apparent, nor was there a clear ministerial strategy. She goes on to say that a largely monocultural public service initially put the directive to one side, but the implications soon became apparent. The Waitangi Tribunal, the courts, and the actions of Maori organisations all tested what this legislative recognition of the treaty meant, with what can only be described as a number of interesting impacts on the government's market reforms. And the public service was not exempt. The 1986 Ministerial Advisory Committee report, Puao Te Atatu, commented on what they defined as the institutional racism of the Department of Social Welfare. A major government department was deemed to have failed in its core business of delivering appropriate services to Māori. Puao Te Atatu helped contribute to a new agenda, a bicultural agenda for government departments, especially those which had a significant Māori client base. So in the years 1985 to 1989, we see the key elements of a new social contract between the state and Māori. Those elements included recognition, especially in legislation, of the Treaty of Waitangi, the policies of biculturalism in the public service, greater recognition of Māori language rights and tikanga Māori, limited self-government, primarily through the devolution of social and educational services to Māori organisations and communities, and the transfer of resources to Māori in recognition of their rights as tangata whenua and as reparation for the effects of colonialism. The subsequent Bolger government was ready to honour these elements of the social contract. Indeed, some of the most significant settlements were to come in the 1990s. The contract that was negotiated in the 1980s has endured remarkably well and largely intact. It has survived 7 general elections, 3 different prime ministers, and 2 significant economic downturns. It has not all been to the liking of people such as Ranginui. The breakup of the Department of Māori Affairs in the late 1980s to be replaced by Te Puna Kōkiri was disappointing, as the delivery of major social and economic programs were to be replaced by the provision of policy advice. The fiscal envelope of the early 1990s, which set a cap on Treaty of Waitangi claims, appeared also to limit Māori treaty rights. Ranginui was concerned that tino rangatiratanga was often too narrowly defined as the tino rangatiratanga of certain iwi, or that tino rangatiratanga had been a step too far for any government. And the new social contract has proved unable to deal with a significant issue, the ongoing socio-economic disadvantage of Māori individuals and households. There is little doubt that Māori organisations and many iwi have benefited from what has happened in the last 3 decades. The reports commissioned by Te Puna Kōkiri in 2003 and then again in 2007 on the Māori economy demonstrate how significant Māori ownership and production is to the New Zealand economy. It can be seen in sectors such as fisheries, farming, tourism and forestry. This Māori economy was calculated as being worth $9 billion in 2003, and that was a 40% increase over the value of the Māori economy only 7 years previously. But that corporate and collective wealth contrasts with the relative lack of Māori household wealth. Before the economic reforms of the 1980s, Māori income was 92% of the national median income. By 2007, it had slipped to 83%. And 1/5 of all Māori lost their jobs between 1987 and 1989. Labour's policy of closing the gaps after 2000 seemed to be a recognition that something needed to be done. But Ranginui was to be disappointed, as he himself said at the time. When Helen set an objective for her government to close the gaps between Māori and Pākehā by the year 2015, it was the most visionary policy set by any politician in recent times. Unfortunately, the policy was dropped from the political agenda when it was criticised by the opposition as favouring Māori ahead of poor Pākehā. The gaps remain structurally entrenched because of the failure of political will to deal with an issue that is a shame to our nation and a blot on our humanity. The social contract has been challenged on other occasions. 2 that are worth brief mention both occurred in 2004. The brash nationhood speech at Orewa in 2004 argued for a return to a single nation of New Zealanders who were not differentiated by law, a return to one law for all. These sentiments had and continue to have an audience, but what was surprising was how limited that audience by 2004 was, and how disastrous that speech proved to be for Brash himself. Apart from media condemnation, the response from Maori was dismissive, including from inside the National Party. As Hekia Parata said at the time, "I am Maori, so to suggest that it is the amount of Maori blood coursing through my veins that determines the degree of cultural identity or my citizenship is nonsense. We are indeed all New Zealanders, just not the same New Zealanders." The other test to these newfound rights of Maori was provided by the foreshore and seabed debate and legislation. The, quote, common heritage of all New Zealanders, unquote, was seen as a denial of Maori rights, and this was unacceptable. And one of the largest protests ever to be seen in Wellington made that very clear. Ranginui again leapt into the debate. With respect to the foreshore of his whakatohia iwi, he wrote, "This remnant of coastline is sacred to me. It's mine, and I will not concede it to you who represent the Crown. I reserve the right to apply to the Maori Land Court for title bequeathed to me by my ancestors. I will not sell 1 millimetre of my coastline, and I will continue to share it, as I've always done, with those who love Kaimoana as I do. You ask who I am? I am Te Whakatohia ki o Potiki." And as Maori representation on the Super City has recently highlighted, perhaps it is inevitable that the treaty and the rights of Maori will continue to be challenged. But as I indicated at the outset, what is surprising is the extent to which there is agreement that Maori do have rights, and the willingness of governments since the 1980s, with some exceptions, to agree to these rights, or at least some of them. Are there unresolved issues? Absolutely. The first concerns tangata whenua rights. If tangata whenua rights are to be defined as primarily those of the iwi who signed the treaty, what happens to non-iwi Māori, those who are not attached or do not identify with a particular iwi? Do they have the same rights? Do they have different rights? Do they have rights? The next is the issue I have already highlighted. The events of the past decade have certainly improved the wealth and economic activity of many Māori iwi and organisations, but this does not always extend to Māori households or individuals. Was closing the gap such a bad policy? And what would do most to address Māori poverty? This, I believe, remains a key and very important policy challenge. And finally, how do the very high levels of immigration post the 1987 policy changes — we have the highest levels of immigration per capita in the OECD and have had since 2000 — impact on the recognition of Māori rights? Do we need to develop a form of multiculturalism which supplements biculturalism rather than competes with it? What was negotiated in the 1970s and 1980s has sent us on a very different path. Our understanding of who we are has been revised, not the least in the extent to which the identity rights of tangata whenua are now recognised as part of the process of building this nation that is Aotearoa, New Zealand. We have revised our understanding of what happened in a colonial past and sought to rectify some of the negative and unjust effects through a treaty settlement process. And we have developed a new vocabulary and new ways of operating in our core institutions, as well as developing some completely new institutions and a sense of what is possible. I would suggest that while the journey is far from complete, that what we have developed is a form of liberal nationalism, one that is prepared to recognise the rights of Māori. These rights at times might be curtailed and they might be subject to constant negotiation, but the alternative, a politically driven illiberal nationalism, has found very little support in recent years. We could argue that the recognition might not go far enough, and that some New Zealanders are still far from happy with what has emerged. But it is a tribute to those who played a key role, people such as Ranginui Walker, that they were prepared to negotiate a new social contract in good faith, a matter of using the ballot rather than bullets, to achieve much more than many of us might have thought possible 3 decades ago. It has been, to say the least, an interesting journey, and I wonder where it will go from here. Whakatau mai kōkiri tātou, kia ora tātou, katoa.
Thank you, Professor Spoonley, speaking in the first session of the Treaty Debates series at Te Papa in Wellington on the subject of the Treaty of Waitangi, evolution and not revolution. I'd like to invite shortly Emeritus Professor Ranginui Walker to join in and to comment. But first I'd just like very briefly to capture again some of the key points of his biography. Paul mentioned he is of the Whakatohea iwi, an academic, an author, biographer, historian, commentator, activist and iwi consultant. He's been professor and head of Maori studies at the University of Auckland and was appointed to the Waitangi Tribunal in 2003. For many years, many of us knew him best possibly by his regular column in The Listener, which educated the public on Maori issues and formed the basis of one of his first books that Paul referred to, Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou. But his many publications are legion, and they include the biography of that famous Maori leader, Sir Aparana Ngata, and more recently also a biography of Paki Harrison of Ngāti Porou, one of New Zealand's great master carvers. Rangi also, of course, and most importantly, received the honour of Distinguished Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2009. It was very much an important marker of how significant he has been. Now, Ranginui, surprisingly, is not going to give a formal speech, but he is ready for questions, and he has never been one to hold back. Dean, on my right, I'm going to ask you to lead off and comment on, perhaps on Paul's lecture, but also to challenge Ranginui to respond. Dean, over to you.
Kia ora mo tēnā. And I think we've been treated to a historical account of the evolution of modern-day New Zealand through the latter part of the last century, and that very much that struggle to ensure society recognises and embraces the rights, the interests and aspirations of Māori, of iwi and hapu. And we've heard particular reference to a number of the key players, including one of our commentators tonight, Dr. Ranginui Walker, who we'll shortly be hearing from, and their contribution to that change. When we reflect on the comments from Professor Spoonley, I think we see that much of the account has been framed as uncharted incremental change led by accidental activists through fragile coalitions. Kiwis, both Māori and Pākehā, muddling through of evolution, not revolution. All in all, though, a successful if incomplete evolution. The one thing we may ask ourselves is to what extent was it still necessary to have those revolutionary moments, or at least the revolutionary spirit within that process of evolution? How important was it to the mobilisation of the movement of Māoridom to frame the campaign as a battle against the imperial establishment, a liberation movement against an oppressive Pākehā state, spurred into action by instances of ill treatment or abuse, the land marches of Aorewa, the foreshore and seabed, and the like. And I think, and I pose this question not merely as a point of historical reflection, because I think it perhaps speaks more to the future. And if we accept Professor Spoonley's evaluation that we have entered the new decade with a spirit of enlightenment, increased involvement of Māori in government and governance, and a new social contract, what does that different dynamic mean for mobilisation of Māoridom and allied Pākehā to address those unresolved issues that he speaks of? Is Māoridom now consigned to catalysing evolution from within? Or is there still a place for the revolutionary attitude, the activism of old? And if so, who will be tomorrow's accidental activists? Where will they come from, especially if many of the leaders have refocused their energy to making change from within government? Does the strategy for evolution need itself to evolve? And with those brief reflections and questions, I pose those questions to our speakers tonight, Professor Walker and Spoonley.
Well, there's a challenge for you boys. Off you go. Ranginui.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you for turning out to hear us tonight. As Paul has alluded, I come from a very conservative background. But initially I grew up in an isolated valley. It's a long way from the Rahui Valley to Auckland, I can tell you. It was a traditional whānau hapu situation where my tribe was crammed into a reservation after the confiscation of the major portion of our land. It was an idyllic existence. No one hungered, no one suffered, children were not beaten. There was love all around me from uncles and aunts and cousins and older siblings. It was an idyllic, warm and comforting world. But it was an unreal world because it was unsustainable. In time, I came to the real world outside, where it was much more competitive, and I knew that that was the world that I had to learn to live in and survive, and the way to get there was through education and working hard. I was always near the top of the class, and at high school I set goals for myself to get degrees, a bachelor's. Wrote them up on the blackboard, a Bachelor of Arts, a Master of Arts and a PhD. And once I'd achieved the PhD, that was when I was called back into the Maori world to help support the people in their struggle against the state that had oppressed them. Now, I personally never felt oppressed because my parents were successful farmers. But I couldn't help but sympathise with those who felt that oppression. And in due course, they appeared at some of the meetings that I chaired on behalf of the Auckland District Māori Council. They were angry. They were talking revolutionary talk, which they derived from the black activists of America, Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver. Now, I was taken aback by that rhetoric. I'd never heard of it. And I feared for the future of my nation if we were going to follow the riots of Watts in America and other places, Detroit. And so I took it upon myself as an educated person working within the university to write about these things in the New Zealand Listener. Is it to be revolution or evolution? And this is what lies ahead of us. Either we will do it peacefully or you will reap the whirlwind. Fortunately, people realise the need to transform our state, and that's what has happened. And Paul has given you a very, very good and clear summary of those events from the 1970s through to the present day. I didn't come here to talk to you really because I've been in retirement for 13 years. I do other things in my life. I don't give public lectures. I don't talk at conferences. However, I am willing to answer any questions that you would like to raise. Thank you.
I'd like to just pose a question to Rangi, and he's probably given me a one-line answer too. In many ways, when I am an Aucklander, and when Rangi was very articulate in the Auckland Maori Council, I couldn't help thinking at that time that maybe he was the right person in the right place at the right time. I mean, he was close to radio, he was close to the media, and so not only was he articulate in the Listener in a very more formal sense, he could very quickly respond to radio. So Rangi, you must have realised too, surely, that you could use the media in such a way that you could score points in an articulate and logical way that would attune to the ear of the largely monocultural population? That's a question.
Absolutely, but sometimes my ability in communicating with the media got me into trouble. Like, for instance, I was on the fly at the time, very busy in the university that I worked in, and on the run, one of the secretaries called me, "Hey, a reporter wants you on the line." So I grabbed the phone, and it was about Maori theft and so on. And I was really in a hurry, and I was quite dismissive of the question. I said, "Look, I just regard crime or theft as redistribution of wealth." Whereupon this radio jock called on his listeners to go around to Ranginui Walker's place and help themselves.
I wonder if we can interrogate the borrowing of some of the strategies from the civil rights movements from abroad, and both of our speakers tonight have alluded to that. But to what extent is the New Zealand community sympathetic to framing claims for change in the language of rights? And secondly, to what extent was our process of activism and change in New Zealand more successful due to the smallness of our community and the fact that our closeness as brothers and sisters together?
I'll answer both briefly, and I'm sure Ranginui will add to those. I think the rights that were imported were redefined locally and given, as I suggested, a New Zealand vernacular. So the rights became rights that were particular to this country. In terms of your second question, I think size is absolutely important. Size has always been to our benefit, and you can see that not simply in what we're talking about tonight in terms of treaty rights. We can see that in a range of other areas of being able to manage quite revolutionary change, in Claudia's words, in a way that doesn't have the whirlwind that Ranginui referred to.
For those of us who were born in our traditional tribal rural communities, we knew who we were. We knew our whakapapa, we knew our ancestors, we knew our waka. But the first generation city-born didn't have that knowledge. They felt lost, alienated, deprived of their language. And these were the angry young activists who appeared before their elders and complained about the Pākehā system oppressing them. So that pushed us into the position of having to negotiate, particularly with the education system, the power brokers within the education department, to ensure that Māori language, Māori culture were incorporated into our pedagogy. And of course, over the last 25, 30 years, that has happened, and our nation is all the better for it.
Thanks, Rangi. You're listening, of course, to the first session in the Treaty Debates series in Soundings Theatre Te Papa on the subject of the treaty. And the series has been organised as a way of providing you, the public, with information on treaty-related issues and to give you an opportunity to consider and discuss those issues. And we are now going to invite questions and comments from the floor.
I'll make this short and sweet. I'm Josh Clark, kia ora. My question's more to Dr. Paul Spoonley. You talked a little bit about how multicultural can probably support biculturalism. I'm just interested to hear what kind of strategies, as New Zealand does become more, as you know, more multicultural.
Kia ora, Josh. I think Ranginui has a view on this. Can I just give mine and allow Ranginui the right to add his? Immigration has provided New Zealand with a very different set of demographic and political dynamics. As I mentioned in the speech, this country has transformed itself through immigration in a way that very few other countries have post-2000. What I think is very disappointing is that the treaty has not been part of the policy discussions, but also that Maori have not been given the role of welcoming those new immigrants here. I think the immigration relationship, if you like, has left Maori out, and that is a position which is unsustainable, and something needs to be done about it.
The preamble to the treaty is New Zealand's first immigration policy, that the chiefs signing that treaty had agreed to the fact that there were British people coming here to New Zealand, the Queen's people, and they needed to be cared for. But in our own time, immigration has become a tool of economic development. And this is what I personally am opposed to. My strategy is pull up the drawbridge. Now, you think about it. The Polynesians are the people of the sea, tangata o te moana. And their strategy was to go from island to island and eat themselves down the food chain. When they got to New Zealand, they couldn't believe it. There were all these fat seals and big walking chickens called moas, and they ate their way down the food chain. And then suddenly they realized that they'd come up to the limits of growth of the hunting, fishing, gathering economy. So they sent someone off into the Southern Ocean, a guy called Hui Te Rangiora, and he came back and reported, there's no more land. Migration from the Pacific stopped. The ocean-going voyages came to an end. And Maori learned to balance their population with what resources that they had. In our hearings of the Waitangi Tribunal on the Whanganui claim, for instance, the local people there had a special relationship with the long-finned eel, the tuna, that migrate up their rivers. And they rotationally harvest the creeks that feed into that river, and they have never depleted the resource. But under the modern economy, where the state manages the distribution of resources and allocation of fishing quota, that resource is now under stress. And this is the madness of the political economy that doesn't recognize the limits to growth. And so there is a place for tangata whenua in the management of our environment, in the management of our resources, because they have that ancient wisdom and connection to the land that should be harnessed along the operations of our institutions such as DOC. Nā kia ora.
Well, that was a good way to end our first session on the Treaty Debate series from Te Papa in Wellington. The speakers, of course, were Professor Paul Spoonley and Emeritus Professor Ranginui Walker, with help from you, the audience, and from Dean Knight of the Law School, and from me, Claudia Orange. So please join us for the next session to hear Professor Mason Dury and Colin James discussing where the treaty is now in New Zealand, its global impacts, and where it is going. Is there a New Zealand agenda? And I'd like you people to show your appreciation for our excellent speakers this evening. Good evening.
This audio is from Radio New Zealand. To find out more, visit radionz.co.nz.
Please, Paul.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, John. Let me start with my pessimistic side. The last 5 to 7 years has seen a distinct shift in the Overton window in radicalizing and normalizing radical ideas yet again, and the sheer volume of it, the fact that it is a global ecosystem, online system, which makes it difficult for country states like ourselves to govern and to manage. And also, it is, to me, a little puzzling that you in Canada, we in New Zealand, should be so influenced by QAnon or Sovereign Citizen or any other sets of politics that come out of the United States, which bear no relationship in many respects to our own political histories. Even though those, I'm not wanting to de-criticize those histories. I want to maintain a critical approach to them. So I do see a polarization, and what keeps me awake at night is how you overcome that degree of polarization, the unwillingness of communities to not treat others respectfully, to attack others, to be very vitriolic and hateful, and not to be guided by facts. Now, there's in terms of what we're doing, there's little that we can find yet to mount something which is effective an answer to that. And what's happened is, of course, that it's gone from being Indigenous or immigrant or Muslim or Jew to transphobic, misogynistic. And so my Prime Minister stood down because of the level of both domestic and international misogyny that she was facing.